The auctioneer's voice carried farther than it needed to on that cold March morning in 1985, the kind of voice trained to sound confident even when no one in the crowd wanted to hear what it was saying, the kind that bounced off the metal siding of the machine shed and came back thinner, flatter, stripped of warmth by the wind that cut across the yard and slid under jackets and collars like it knew exactly where to go. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today for the liquidation sale of the Schroeder Farm operation, 640 acres, Faribault County, Minnesota. Equipment will start at 9, livestock at 11, land parcels at 2 o'clock this afternoon. He said it the way men always said it when they wanted to pretend this was routine, when they wanted to pretend this was just another Thursday and not the end of something that had taken 23 years to build and about 5 months to destroy. Tom Schroeder stood 30 feet back from the edge of the crowd, far enough that no one would feel obligated to look at him, close enough that he could still hear every word. His arms were crossed tight against his chest, not because he was cold, but because he didn't know what else to do with them, the same way you don't know what to do with your hands when someone tells you bad news and then keeps talking. His wife Linda wasn't there. She couldn't be. 3 days earlier, she'd taken the kids to her sister's place in Fairmont, packed their overnight bags like it was just a visit, not saying out loud that she didn't want them to see strangers walking through their yard, pointing at tractors and cattle like they were items in a catalog. Tom hadn't argued. There are moments when you know arguing won't change anything, when you know the argument itself would be another loss, another thing you'd have to carry. The crowd was bigger than Tom had expected, maybe 200 people. Clustered in loose knots that shifted and tightened as more trucks pulled in along the fence line. Some were neighbors, men he'd known since high school, men who had borrowed tools from him and returned them late, men who had sat at the same tables at church suppers and talked about yields and weather and how things were getting harder every year. Some were dealers from out of town, from places like Sioux Falls and Worthington, the kind who showed up early and walked the rows of equipment with clipboards, already doing the math on how much they could make by Monday morning once the dust was washed off and the prices were doubled. And some, Tom knew exactly who they were without needing to ask, stood a little apart from everyone else. Clean jackets, neat hair, eyes that didn't linger too long on anything. Men from the First Agricultural Bank of Blue Earth, the same bank that had called his operating loan in November, the same bank that had refused every restructuring proposal his lawyer had submitted, the same bank that had decided, quietly and efficiently, that the Schroeder farm was no longer a family operation but an asset that needed to be cleared off their books. Standing at the very back of the crowd, almost hidden behind a grain truck with rust creeping along its fenders, was Rick Pulaski. He was 42 years old, farming about 800 acres 6 miles north, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his Carhartt jacket, his John Deere cap pulled low. No one was paying him any attention. That was normal. Rick had never been the kind of man who drew eyes. Before any of this makes sense, you have to understand what the farm economy looked like in early 1985, because without that context, this would sound like a simple story about one man losing his land, and it wasn't simple at all. Farm debt across the country had climbed to $215 billion, nearly triple what it had been just 7 years earlier. In Minnesota alone, more than 400 farms had entered foreclosure proceedings in 1984. Land that had peaked in 1981 at over $2,000 an acre in good areas was now selling for less than $900 if you could find a buyer. The farm economy wasn't struggling, it was collapsing. The Schroeder farm had been worth around $380,000 just 4 years earlier. Tom owed $340,000 on it now, after the bank had rolled years of unpaid interest into the principal, the debt quietly growing while everyone pretended it was manageable. At auction, if he was honest with himself, the land would be lucky to bring $200,000. Tom knew it, the bank knew it, everyone standing in that yard knew it, and the bank didn't care. They wanted the asset off their books. They would foreclose, take the loss on paper, and sell the land to an investor within 6 months when prices recovered enough to make it worthwhile. It was standard procedure for agricultural lenders in 1985. Tom wasn't a bad farmer. That was the part that hurt the most. He had done what he was told.
In 1979, the county extension agent had encouraged him to expand. An agricultural economist from the University of Minnesota had shown him charts that proved land values would keep climbing. His loan officer at First Ag had looked him in the eye and said, "Tom, you're leaving money on the table if you don't leverage up and grow." So Tom had bought his neighbor's quarter section. He'd upgraded his equipment. He'd followed the advice of people who supposedly knew better. Then interest rates hit 21%. Then the grain embargo dried up export markets. Then land prices collapsed. Then operating loans got called. Doing everything right hadn't mattered at all. "Lot number 1, the auctioneer called out. "John Deere 4440, 1979 model, showing 4,200 hours. We'll start the bidding at $12,000. The 4440 was Tom's primary tractor. 110 horsepower, sound guard cab, synchro range transmission. He'd bought it new in 1979 for $38,000. At $12,000, it was worth less than a decent pickup. "$12,000? Do I hear 12? The auctioneer said, his voice moving automatically through the cadence he'd learned years ago. "12? Yes, sir. 13. 14. The bidding climbed slowly, cautiously, like no one wanted to be the first to admit how low things had fallen. A dealer from Worthington dropped out at 16. A farmer from Martin County went to 17.5 and stopped. The tractor sold for $18,200 to an implement dealer who had driven down from Marshall. Tom watched the man hand over a cashier's check, watched the way he nodded like this was just business, because for him it was. By Monday morning, that tractor would be cleaned up and sitting on a lot with a price tag that said $28,000. It went like that all morning. The International 1086 Tom used for heavy tillage, bought for $27,000 in 1978, sold for $11,500. The John Deere 7000 planter, 6-row with monitor, went for $4,800. The disc, the gravity wagon, pieces of his life reduced to numbers that barely seemed real. Rick Pulowski watched every lot. He didn't bid on anything. He just watched. Around noon, during the break before the livestock sale, Tom's brother drove up from Fairmont and found him sitting on the tailgate of his truck, staring at nothing. "You okay?" his brother asked, because that's what you ask even when you know the answer. Tom didn't respond right away. Then he said, "You know what the worst part is? It's not losing the farm. I mean, it is, but it's not. The worst part is knowing that in 6 months the bank's going to sell this land to some doctor from the cities who wants a tax write-off, or some corporation, and it'll go for what it's actually worth, and I won't see a dime of that. I'll still owe them $140,000 after today. They get the land, and they get to sue me for the rest." His wife didn't have anything to say to that. There wasn't an answer that made it better. The livestock sale went faster. The Holstein herd brought decent money. Dairy prices were holding better than grain. But watching the cattle sell, cattle he'd raised from calves, some of them, they knew his voice. By 1:45, the crowd started to gather again, drawn toward the driveway where the auctioneer had set up his platform for the land sale. This was what everyone had really come for. 640 acres of Class A soil, tile drained, less than 2 miles from a paved road. Good ground, the kind that didn't come up for sale often. Except now it did. Somewhere in Minnesota, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, every single week, another farm went under the hammer. The auctioneer explained the parcels: the home quarter with the buildings, the north and south quarters, the west 80. Bidding would start at $1,000 per acre on the home quarter, land that should have been worth $1,500 minimum, $2,000 in a normal market. Tom's jaw tightened. The bank's appraiser had valued it at $850 per acre for the foreclosure. That's what Tom would be credited, no matter what it sold for. Anything above that, the bank would pocket as recovery costs. "Do I hear $1,000 per acre?" the auctioneer said. $160,000 for the home quarter with all improvements. A hand went up, a local farmer who had been expanding by buying foreclosed land for 2 years. $1,000, $1,000, the auctioneer repeated. "Do I hear $10.50?
Another hand, one of the bank representatives. $1,100. The local farmer shook his head. He knew better. When the bank bid, you didn't fight. The bank had infinite money and no conscience. "Going once at $1,100, the auctioneer said, and then Rick Pulowski's hand went up. $1,200. Every head in the crowd turned. Tom's stomach dropped. Rick Pulowski? Rick had no business bidding on land in 1985. Half the people there figured Rick would be in Tom's position within a year. The bank representative raised his hand again. 1,300. Rick didn't hesitate. 1,400. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uneasy. This wasn't how these auctions usually went. Usually, the bank bid once or twice and everyone else stayed quiet because they knew how it ended. 1,500, the bank said, louder now. 1,600, Rick replied, steady, clear. The bank representative's face flushed. 1,700. Rick paused, just long enough for Tom's heart to sink, then said 1,800. And in that moment, standing in that yard with the wind cutting through his jacket and the ground feeling suddenly unsteady under his boots, Tom realized that something had changed, even if he didn't yet understand what it was. And whatever was about to happen next, good or bad, there was no turning back. The sound that followed Rick Pawlowski's $1,800 bid wasn't applause or shouting or anything clean like that. It was the low, restless noise a crowd makes when it realizes it's watching something it doesn't quite understand. Boots shifting on frozen gravel, someone clearing their throat too loudly, a couple of men turning to each other with expressions that said this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The auctioneer hesitated just a fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone to call it a pause, but long enough for Tom to feel it, like a skipped heartbeat. He'd worked hundreds of auctions, maybe thousands, and he knew the rhythm of these things the way a drummer knows a song. This rhythm was off. 1,800 per acre, he repeated, his voice professional but thinner now. $288,000 for the home quarter. Do I hear 19? The bank representative didn't answer immediately. He leaned slightly toward the man beside him, not enough that anyone could hear what was being said, but enough that everyone could see the movement, could see that this wasn't just a number on a clipboard anymore. Tom watched the exchange the way a man watches a storm roll in from a distance, knowing it's coming, but still hoping it will veer off at the last minute. He'd seen these auctions before, had stood in other yards watching neighbors lose land, and there was always a moment like this, a moment when someone tested the boundary and then backed off, because the truth was simple and brutal. You didn't fight the bank. The bank had money that didn't feel pain, money that didn't wake up at 3 in the morning wondering how it was going to make payroll or pay for seed. The bank could outlast you. That was the fix everyone knew, the unspoken rule that made these sales move quickly and quietly. The bank representative straightened, lifted his hand. 1,900, he said, louder than before, the number landing with a kind of challenge in it. Tom felt something twist in his chest. This was the part where it usually ended, where whoever had tried to push things a little higher realized they'd gone far enough. Rick Pawlowski didn't look at the bankman. He didn't look at anyone. He stared straight ahead, eyes narrowed slightly against the wind, and said, 2,000. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm in a way that felt almost disrespectful, like he was ordering a cup of coffee instead of obligating himself to another $32,000 in the worst farm economy anyone in that crowd had ever lived through. 2,000 per acre. $320,000. The number hung there, heavy and unmistakable. Someone behind Tom let out a low whistle before catching themselves and stopping. Tom didn't move. He was afraid that if he did, if he shifted his weight or turned his head, the moment would break apart and this would all snap back to what it was supposed to be. The bank representative's face had gone red, not the slow red of embarrassment, but the sharp flush of anger. He turned again to his colleague, this time more urgently, hands moving, shoulders tight. The auctioneer filled the space with his practiced patter. 2,000 per acre. Do I hear any advance? 2,000 going once, trying to keep control of something that was slipping out of its usual channels. Tom's mind raced, not with hope but with confusion. Rick couldn't afford this. Everyone knew Rick's situation. He farmed 800 acres, sure, but he was leveraged too, like everyone else. There was no secret pot of money Rick could be sitting on. This didn't make sense. And because it didn't make sense, it was terrifying. The bank huddle lasted longer this time. The men leaned in close, heads nearly touching, and Tom found himself watching their mouths instead of listening to the auctioneer, trying to read something in their expressions that would tell him how this was going to end.
He'd spent months watching men like this sit across desks from him, nodding sympathetically while telling him there was nothing they could do. He knew that look. It wasn't doubt, it was calculation. When the bank representative straightened again, the yard went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. He turned to Rick Pulowski, really looked at him now, and for a brief second Tom thought he saw something like disbelief flicker across the man's face, as if the rules he'd relied on for years had just failed him. Then he shook his head sharply and stepped back into the crowd. "Sold," the auctioneer said, his gavel coming down hard. "Sold to bidder number 73, Rick Pulowski, at $2,000 per acre." The noise that followed this time was louder, confused voices overlapping, men turning to each other with wide eyes, some shaking their heads, others letting out nervous laughs like this might all be a joke they didn't quite get yet. Tom felt dizzy. Rick had just bought his farm. With what money Tom didn't know, and why he couldn't begin to guess. Before he could sort any of it out, the auctioneer was already moving on. "North Quarter, 160 acres, excellent tillable ground, some terracing. We'll start at $1,000 per acre." The bank bid immediately, $1,000, almost reflexively, as if to remind everyone that this was how things were supposed to work. Rick's hand went up before the auctioneer could even ask for an advance, $1,500. The bank man's jaw tightened, $1,600. Rick didn't pause this time. $2,000. The number landed again, just as clean and final as before. The bank representative didn't even bother to turn to his colleagues. He stared at Rick Pulowski, really looked at him now, and for a brief second Tom thought he saw something like disbelief flicker across the man's face, as if the rules he'd relied on for years had just failed him. Then he shook his head sharply and walked away from the auction, his boots crunching on the gravel loud in the sudden quiet. His two colleagues followed 30 seconds later, faces blank, climbing into their car and pulling out of the yard without looking back. The auctioneer stood there, gavel in hand, clearly unsure what to do next. "Well," he said finally, "sold to bidder number 73 at $2,000 per acre." It went the same way with the South Quarter and the West 80. Rick bid each parcel to exactly $2,000. Nobody else raised a hand. By 3:15 that afternoon, Rick Pulowski owned all 640 acres of the Schroeder farm. Total price, $1,280,000. The crowd didn't cheer. This wasn't a victory anyone knew how to celebrate. It felt more like the aftermath of something dangerous, the moment after a car accident when everyone is still standing there, stunned, trying to understand what just happened. People did the math in their heads, lips moving silently, and the conclusion was always the same. Rick had just obligated himself to more than $1 million in debt in a market that was chewing farmers up and spitting them out. This wasn't brave, this was suicidal. Tom pushed his way through the crowd toward Rick, his heart pounding with something that might be hope and might be anger. "Rick, what the hell did you just do?" he said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "You can't afford this. You know you can't afford this." Rick looked at him, really looked at him now, and for the first time that day, Tom saw something in his expression other than calm. It wasn't panic, it was something steadier, heavier. Rick reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a plain white envelope, sealed, unmarked. "Open it when you get home," Rick said, "not here." Then he turned away, already asking the auctioneer where he needed to sign to settle up. Tom stood there holding the envelope like it was fragile, like it might fall apart in his hands if he squeezed too hard. Around him, the crowd began to drift away, the shock wearing off and turning into conversation, into speculation. By dinner time, Tom knew, everyone in Faribault County would be talking about what Rick Pulowski had done. Most of them would be saying he'd lost his mind.
Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Rick's careful block letters. "Tom," it read, "the farm is still yours. I bought it to keep the bank from getting it. Total cost, including auction fees, $1,287,400. I'm selling it back to you for exactly what I paid. You can pay me when you can pay me. If that's 5 years from now, fine. If it's 10 years, fine. If it's never, that's fine too. The bank doesn't get to win. Not this time." Tom read it once, then again, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else if he looked away. Then he sat down on the front steps and cried. the kind of crying that comes when your body finally gives up on holding things together. Tom Schroeder didn't open the envelope right away. He sat in the truck for a long time with it resting on the seat beside him, the paper inside shifting slightly every time the wind rocked the cab, as if reminding him that whatever was written there already existed whether he was ready to read it or not. The yard looked different now that the crowd was gone. The ruts in the gravel were deeper than he remembered making them, the fence posts leaned a little more than they had that morning, and the silence felt heavier for having been earned. For most of his life, Tom had believed that if something was going to be taken from you, you would feel it happening, that there would be a clear moment when loss arrived and announced itself. Instead, this day had unfolded in pieces, each one dulling him just enough to survive the next. He had watched his equipment sell for a fraction of what it was worth. He had watched men bid on his cattle, cattle that knew his voice, cattle he had raised in the dark and the cold. He had watched the bank do what the bank always did, and then, just when his mind had started to shut down in self-defense, Rick Pulowski had raised his hand and refused to let the ending land where it was supposed to. None of it felt real yet. Tom drove slowly back to the house, the envelope still unopened, his eyes tracking familiar landmarks like he needed to convince himself they were still there. The mailbox, the stand of trees along the west fence line, the slight dip in the driveway where water always collected in spring. He parked, turned off the engine, and sat for another minute before finally opening the door. Inside the house, the quiet was different from the yard. It wasn't empty, it was waiting. The envelope felt heavier now that he was holding it, heavier than a single sheet of paper should have felt, and for a moment Tom considered setting it down and calling Linda first, letting her voice steady him before he read whatever Rick had written. But he knew he wouldn't be able to explain it without understanding it himself. He broke the seal carefully, the way you do with something that feels important, and unfolded the paper. The words were written in Rick's careful block letters, plain, unadorned, no attempt to soften what they said. Tom, the farm is still yours. I bought it to keep the bank from getting it. Total cost, including auction fees, $1,287,400. I'm selling it back to you for exactly what I paid. You can pay me when you can pay me. If that's 5 years from now, fine. If it's 10 years, fine. If it's never, that's fine too. The bank doesn't get to win. Not this time. Tom read it once without reacting, his mind skimming the words like they might rearrange themselves into something more familiar if he didn't look too closely. He read it again, slower this time, the meaning beginning to seep in despite his resistance. By the third time, the room tilted slightly, and he had to sit down. He didn't cry right away. First, there was a long, hollow pause, like the moment after you've been hit and your body hasn't decided yet whether it hurts. Then the weight of it came down all at once, and he cried the way people cry when something that was supposed to break them doesn't. That night, after Linda called and he read the letter to her over the phone, after her voice cracked and then steadied, after the kids asked questions that didn't have answers yet, Tom lay awake replaying the day from the beginning, trying to understand how a man like Rick Pulowski ended up holding the fate of his family in an envelope. The next morning, with the sun low and the air still sharp, Tom drove north to Rick's place. He didn't call ahead. He didn't know what he would have said if he had. Rick was out by the machine shed when Tom pulled in, working on a piece of equipment that looked older than some of the things Tom had just watched sell at auction. Rick looked up, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded like this was a normal visit on a normal day. Tom handed him the letter without speaking. Rick glanced at it, then back at Tom. "You read it," he said. Tom nodded. "Why?" Tom asked, and the word came out flatter than he expected. Rick didn't answer right away. He leaned back against the shed, the metal cold through his jacket, and looked out across his own fields. "My dad lost our farm in 1961, he said. "Different crisis, same story. Prices dropped, loans got called, bank took everything." He didn't say it with anger. He said it the way you say something you've carried for so long it no longer needs emphasis. "He never really recovered," Rick went on. "Worked in a meatpacking plant in Albert Lea after that. 17 years. Hated every minute of it.
never stopped feeling like something had been taken from him that he wasn't supposed to lose. Rick paused, then added, "I was a kid, but you feel that kind of thing. It gets into the walls of a house. It settles into how a man sits at the table, how he talks or doesn't. When he died in '78, Rick said, I swore at his funeral that I wouldn't let that happen again if I could stop it." Tom listened, the pieces aligning in a way that made the impossible feel deliberate, almost inevitable. When land prices started climbing in the late '70s, Rick said, everyone thought it would last forever. When they started falling, most people were already too deep to move. I saw it coming early enough to get out of part of it. Sold a quarter section I'd bought in '76 while prices were still high, paid down my debt as far as I could. Then I did something that made my wife think I'd lost my mind. Rick smiled faintly at that. I stopped farming 200 acres of my best ground, rented it out, fixed what I could myself, didn't buy new equipment, saved everything. Tom frowned. "For what?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "For this," Rick said. "For when someone stood in a yard like that and realized the system had decided they were done. I didn't know it would be you," he added. "I just knew it would be someone." Tom felt a slow, uncomfortable tightening in his chest. "You planned this," he said. Rick shrugged. "I prepared for it. There's a difference. By the time I showed up yesterday, I had $340,000 in cash. The rest I borrowed from a bank in Rochester that knows me well enough to know I'm good for it." Tom thought about the way Rick's voice stayed level as the bids climbed, how he hadn't hesitated even once. That kind of calm didn't come from impulse, it came from rehearsal. "Why not tell anyone?" Tom asked. "Why not say something sooner?" Rick shook his head. "Because if people know what you're doing, they either try to stop you or they try to turn it into something it isn't. I wasn't there to make a point. I was there to keep the bank from getting your land. That was it." They stood there for a while after that. The conversation had run its course without really ending. Tom wanted to say thank you, but the words felt small compared to what had been done. Rick seemed to sense it and waved it off before it could land. "Get back to work. You've got a farm to run." As Tom drove home, the meaning of the letter shifted again, settling into something heavier and more durable. This wasn't charity. It wasn't luck. It was the result of a choice made years earlier, quietly, without guarantees. Rick hadn't saved him because he was special. He'd saved him because he had decided long ago that when the moment came, he would not look away. And for the first time since the auction, Tom understood that what had happened wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a debt that had nothing to do with money. After that visit to Rick's shed, Tom tried to return to ordinary life, but ordinary wasn't available anymore, not in the way it used to be. The fields were still there. The chores showed up like they always did. The bills still arrived on the same days, but the meaning of everything had shifted. Before the auction, Tom had been fighting to keep a farm. After the auction, he was fighting to keep a promise alive, even if no one had called it that out loud. The first weeks were paperwork, signatures, and the strange sensation of standing in your own yard while knowing that on paper it had briefly belonged to someone else. Rick handled most of the legal details with a blunt practicality, not because he enjoyed it, but because he didn't trust anyone else to keep it clean. He didn't want the First Agricultural Bank of Blue Earth to have an excuse to pull at loose threads, to point at something imperfect and say the deal was invalid or the transfer was questionable. The bank, for its part, moved with a cold efficiency that told Tom everything he needed to know about how often they do this. They were polite, even pleasant at times, the way people are when they're trying to close a file and move on, but there was no warmth in it. No sense that they had learned anything or regretted anything. They had expected to walk away with land at foreclosure value and the power to come after Tom afterward for the deficiency. And now they were walking away without the land and without the easy story they liked to tell themselves about farmers who deserved what happened because they had overextended. Tom realized something then that was hard to admit even to himself. The system didn't need you to be wrong. The system only needed you to be vulnerable. Once the paperwork was settled and the farm was formally back under Tom's name, the practical problem in front of him became simple in its cruelty. He owed Rick more money than he could imagine paying quickly, and he owed it in a market that still felt like it was sinking. But the debt didn't feel like what he'd owed the bank. A bank loan was a weight that sat on your chest while someone across town slept peacefully. This debt felt like a pair of eyes you could picture, a kitchen that needed remodeling, a truck that would keep running a few more years because it had to.
That knowledge didn't make the debt easier. It made it sharper. It made Tom work harder than he had ever worked, not to prove something to the bank, not to protect pride, but because he could not stand the idea of Rick taking a hit for him longer than necessary. Linda came home with the kids once it was clear they weren't going to be forced out, but coming home didn't mean the fear left. It just changed shape. It became a quiet, constant monitoring of everything. The pantry, the checkbook, the gas tank, the way the kids asked for things without understanding why the answer was different now. Tom and Linda stopped talking about the future in big, dreamy terms. They talked about spring seed. They talked about the hog market. They talked about whether Tom should take a winter job in town and how they'd handle childcare if Linda did too. Survival makes planners out of people who never wanted to plan that much. Tom diversified because he had to, not because he wanted to. Hogs were a gamble, and every gamble felt dangerous now, but grain alone wasn't going to carry them. He rented extra ground when he could, even when it meant longer days and more wear on equipment he no longer had the option to replace. He learned how to do repairs himself that he used to hire out because the labor cost was money he couldn't justify anymore. He started counting in a new way, not just dollars but hours, because time was suddenly currency too. Meanwhile, the story of what Rick had done traveled outward like ripples. At first, it was just talk in Faribault County, then neighboring counties, then friends of friends. The same way bad news spreads fast in rural places, so does the rare kind of news that makes people sit up and wonder if the rules might not be as permanent as they thought. Cars began pulling into Rick's driveway at odd hours. Sometimes it was men Tom recognized. Sometimes it was strangers with tired faces and hands that looked like they'd been clenched around stress for months. They came with the same posture, shoulders slightly hunched, hats held awkwardly, as if asking for help required apologizing for needing it. They talked in half sentences, embarrassed by their own desperation, trying to sound matter-of-fact while their eyes gave them away. "I heard what you did over at Schroeder's," they would say. "I'm in trouble. The bank's not working with me. I don't know what else to do." Rick listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer false comfort. And then he would tell them the truth, which was the hardest part. He couldn't save everyone. He didn't have infinite money. The bank in Rochester that had lent to him wasn't a charity either. They had limits, and even with Rick's credibility, they would only go so far. Some farms were too far underwater. Some situations were too complex, too tangled in years of rolling interest and falling prices, and Rick understood that if he tried to pull everyone out, he would drown too, and then he would be no help to anyone. That truth made him look like the system sometimes, and he hated that, but he lived inside reality, not wishes. Still, the sheer fact that he had shown up once and changed an outcome inspired others who had been sitting on cash, small reserves, or land they could sell. Within 2 weeks, 8 farmers from Faribault, Blue Earth, and Martin counties formed what they called a Fair Price Committee. And the name mattered because it told the story they wanted to tell themselves. This wasn't about stealing farms or humiliating banks. It was about forcing a fair price in a rigged moment, about refusing to let lenders buy land cheap and then pretend the cheapness proved the farmer was worthless. There were no bylaws, no officers, no meetings in fancy rooms. They met at kitchen tables in machine sheds, talking in low voices, drawing up rough plans on scrap paper, asking who could bring how much cash, who could get a line of credit, who had an auction coming up next. They weren't revolutionaries. They were exhausted men who had watched neighbors go under and realized exhaustion was no longer an excuse for silence. The first time they showed up together at a foreclosure auction after Tom's didn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked like 8 trucks parked along a fence line and 8 men standing in a loose line, hands in pockets, not smiling. But everyone felt it. The bank representatives felt it. The dealers felt it. The other farmers felt it. The auctioneer felt it because the room changed. The committee didn't threaten anyone. They didn't shout. They didn't do what people had done in the 1930s with penny auctions, where communities would intimidate outside bidders and bid a penny on everything. That era was gone. Banks had learned. Sheriffs showed up now. Charges got filed. The farm credit system had federal authority behind it.
You couldn't just bully your way through with a crowd anymore, and even if you could, Rick wouldn't have done it. He wasn't interested in violence, and he wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in forcing the market to reveal what it already knew, that the land had value, and that a crisis wasn't the same as worthlessness. So the committee's method was simple. They bid. They bid with cash. They bid calmly. They bid high enough that the bank could no longer pretend it was doing a routine liquidation. And for a little while, it worked. They saved 4 farms before the banks adjusted. 4 families stayed on their land who would have been gone otherwise. 4 sets of kids finished school in the same district. 4 kitchens stayed full through winter. 4 barns stayed in use. Those are small numbers on a spreadsheet. In a community, they aren't small at all. But nothing about it was clean or heroic for long, because economics doesn't care how good your intentions are. Commodity prices stayed low longer than anyone expected. Interest stayed high. Equipment broke. Weather did what weather does. And debt, once you pick it up, doesn't let you set it down just because you've done something morally admirable. 2 of the 8 farmers in that committee ended up in foreclosure themselves within 3 years. It happened quietly at first, the way trouble always creeps in. A missed payment, a conversation with a loan officer that suddenly sounded like the conversations Tom had been having months earlier. A request for an extension that came back with conditions that felt like a trap. These were men who had been strong enough to show up for other people, and now they were standing in the same cold yards they had tried to protect, realizing the ground under them had been eroding while they were looking outward. The community's reaction was complicated, because people wanted to believe good deeds were rewarded, and the sight of a man being punished for doing what everyone claimed was right was hard to hold in your mind. Some people avoided it. Some people looked away. Some people muttered that it was foolish to fight a bank, as if the existence of consequences proved the fight had been wrong. Rick didn't say much when those 2 farmers went down. He didn't scold anyone. He didn't offer false comfort. And then he would tell them the truth, which was the hardest part. He couldn't save everyone. He didn't have infinite money. The bank in Rochester that had lent to him wasn't a charity either. They had limits, and even with Rick's credibility, they would only go so far. Some farms were too far underwater. Some situations were too complex, too tangled in years of rolling interest and falling prices, and Rick understood that if he tried to pull everyone out, he would drown too, and then he would be no help to anyone. That truth made him look like the system sometimes, and he hated that, but he lived inside reality, not wishes. Still, the sheer fact that he had shown up once and changed an outcome inspired others who had been sitting on cash, small reserves, or land they could sell. Within 2 weeks, 8 farmers from Faribault, Blue Earth, and Martin counties formed what they called a Fair Price Committee, and the name mattered because it told the story they wanted to tell themselves. This wasn't about stealing farms or humiliating banks. It was about forcing a fair price in a rigged moment, about refusing to let lenders buy land cheap and then pretend the cheapness proved the farmer was worthless. There were no bylaws, no officers, no meetings in fancy rooms. They met at kitchen tables in machine sheds, talking in low voices, drawing up rough plans on scrap paper, asking who could bring how much cash, who could get a line of credit, who had an auction coming up next. They weren't revolutionaries. They were exhausted men who had watched neighbors go under and realized exhaustion was no longer an excuse for silence. The first time they showed up together at a foreclosure auction after Tom's didn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked like 8 trucks parked along a fence line and 8 men standing in a loose line, hands in pockets, not smiling. But everyone felt it. The bank representatives felt it. The dealers felt it. The other farmers felt it. The auctioneer felt it because the room changed. The committee didn't threaten anyone. They didn't shout. They didn't do what people had done in the 1930s with penny auctions, where communities would intimidate outside bidders and bid a penny on everything. That era was gone. Banks had learned. Sheriffs showed up now. Charges got filed. The farm credit system had federal authority behind it. You couldn't just bully your way through with a crowd anymore, and even if you could, Rick wouldn't have done it. He wasn't interested in violence, and he wasn't interested in spectacle. He was interested in forcing the market to reveal what it already knew, that the land had value, and that a crisis wasn't the same as worthlessness. So the committee's method was simple. They bid. They bid with cash. They bid calmly. They bid high enough that the bank could no longer pretend it was doing a routine liquidation. And for a little while, it worked. They saved 4 farms before the banks adjusted. 4 families stayed on their land who would have been gone otherwise. 4 sets of kids finished school in the same district. 4 kitchens stayed full through winter. 4 barns stayed in use. Those are small numbers on a spreadsheet. In a community, they aren't small at all. But nothing about it was clean or heroic for long, because economics doesn't care how good your intentions are. Commodity prices stayed low longer than anyone expected. Interest stayed high. Equipment broke. Weather did what weather does. And debt, once you pick it up, doesn't let you set it down just because you've done something morally admirable. 2 of the 8 farmers in that committee ended up in foreclosure themselves within 3 years. It happened quietly at first, the way trouble always creeps in. A missed payment, a conversation with a loan officer that suddenly sounded like the conversations Tom had been having months earlier. A request for an extension that came back with conditions that felt like a trap. These were men who had been strong enough to show up for other people, and now they were standing in the same cold yards they had tried to protect, realizing the ground under them had been eroding while they were looking at.
The auctioneer began the same way, cheerful voice trying to pretend this wasn't a funeral without a casket. Tom watched the bank bid. He watched the hesitation in everyone else's hands. He watched Don's face as each number landed, each number carving away another piece of his life. Then Rick Pulowski arrived. He didn't announce himself. He didn't stride in like a hero. He parked, got out, and stood at the edge of the crowd with his hands in his pockets, the same way he had at Tom's sale, like a man who didn't want attention but understood he might draw it anyway. When the land came up, the bank bid. Rick bid back. The numbers climbed. The bank pushed. Rick pushed harder. Tom saw the same pattern, but it looked different now because he understood what it cost. Each bid was not just money, it was another year of delayed expansion, another repair done instead of replacement, another argument at Rick's kitchen table about what they could keep living without. The bank representatives huddled the way they always did, faces tight, calculating whether winning was worth the price of being seen losing control in public. Rick held steady. He didn't glare, he didn't shout, he just refused to blink. In the end, the bank stepped back. The auctioneer's gavel tamed down. Rick bought the farm. Don didn't look relieved at first. He looked bewildered like Tom had, because the immediate emotion in a moment like that isn't gratitude, it's shock that reality has changed shape. Later, after the paperwork, Don got what Tom had gotten, a plain letter, a deal at cost, the chance to stay. But the fact that Rick could do it twice didn't make it easier, it made it heavier, because it proved the need was everywhere and Rick was only one man. That day on the drive home, Tom realized something else that scared him more than the bank ever had. The system would always adapt. If you pushed it one way, it would shift another. The banks began moving away from public auctions when they sensed resistance. They started arranging sealed bid sales where community pressure couldn't gather and stare them down. They started selling directly to investors before foreclosures were even finalized, cutting the farmer out of the process faster, cleaner, with less public ugliness. They brought sheriffs more often. They relied on paperwork and procedure, and the fact that most people didn't have the energy to fight in 10 directions at once. Rick couldn't stop that. He knew he couldn't. The committee couldn't stop it either. What they could do, what they had done, was carve out a few moments where the machine didn't run smoothly, where a family didn't get ground up as quietly as it would have otherwise. For Tom, that knowledge became both comfort and pressure. Comfort because he wasn't crazy for feeling like the system was built to break people. Pressure because he had survived one of those moments and now he had to decide what that survival meant. He couldn't become Rick. He didn't have the cash, the preparation, the stubborn moral clarity, but he could stop pretending that staying silent was neutral. He could show up. He could help where he could. He could admit, at least to himself, that the difference between losing a farm and keeping it sometimes came down to whether someone else was willing to take a hit for you. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. By the time the next winter arrived, Tom's life had narrowed into the essentials: work, family, debt, and a quiet determination that he would not waste the chance he had been given. The fear never left, but it changed from panic into something like discipline.
He learned to live with it the way you learn to live with chronic pain, adjusting your movements, choosing carefully where to spend your strength. He also learned that even when a neighbor saves you, the system doesn't suddenly become kind. It simply moves on to the next file, the next farm, the next family, as if nothing had happened. That, more than anything, was what made Rick's choice so hard to understand and so hard to dismiss. He wasn't fighting because he believed he would win forever. He was fighting because he refused to let the machine make everyone look away at the same time. By the time Tom Schroeder made the last payment to Rick Pawlowski, the world felt different in ways that were hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through the years in between. It was a Saturday morning in June of 1992, the kind of morning that looked ordinary enough from the outside, the sun already high, the air warm without being heavy yet. The barnyard looked almost the same as it had the day of the auction, though Tom knew better now to trust appearances. Time changes places quietly, the way it changes people. You don't notice it day to day, but if you stand still long enough and really look, the differences are there. Rick was leaning against the fence when Tom pulled in, hands in his pockets, the same posture Tom had come to associate with moments that mattered more than they looked like they should. Tom held the cashier's check carefully, as if it might dissolve if he gripped it too tightly. $87,000, the final installment. 7 years compressed into a single piece of paper. "We're square," Tom said, and his voice wavered despite his effort to keep it steady. Rick took the check, glanced at it, then looked back at Tom. "We were always square, but I appreciate this." Tom nodded, unsure what to say next, because gratitude felt inadequate and apology felt misplaced. He settled on the question that had been sitting with him for years. "What did it cost you, really?" he asked, "carrying my debt all that time?" Rick didn't answer right away. He stared out across the fields, the wind moving the tops of the corn just enough to make the rows ripple. Then he shrugged, almost apologetically. "I couldn't expand," he said. "Drove the same truck for 10 years. Margaret made do with a kitchen that needed remodeling." Tom felt his chest tighten and started to say he was sorry, but Rick cut him off with a small shake of his head. "Don't," he said. "That wasn't a cost. That was the point." They stood there for a few more minutes after that, not talking, the moment complete without needing to be marked by anything louder. Life didn't suddenly become easier for Tom after that payment. It didn't need to. The farm was still demanding, the margins still thin, the future still uncertain in the way it always is when your living depends on weather, markets, and forces far beyond your control. But something fundamental had shifted. The debt that had hung over him like a verdict was gone, replaced by a quieter obligation, one that had less to do with money and more to do with how he chose to move through the world. Tom didn't talk much about the auction in the years that followed, not because he wanted to forget it, but because it had become something that didn't belong to him alone anymore. It belonged to the land, to the people who had stood in that yard, to the men who had raised their hands or kept them down. When his son began taking over more of the day-to-day operation, Tom told him the story not as a lesson or a warning, but as context, the way you explain a scar without dramatizing how you got it. The farm had been under the Schroeder name since 1947. Keeping it that way felt less like an achievement than a responsibility. When Tom's grandson started talking about taking it over someday, Tom listened without comment, knowing better now to assume continuity was guaranteed. If the story of the farm had taught him anything, it was that nothing about land or legacy was automatic. It had to be chosen again and again, often at a cost. The world beyond Faribault County moved on, as it always does. The farm crisis faded from national headlines, replaced by new concerns, new crises that demanded attention. In 1987, the First Agricultural Bank of Blue Earth collapsed after its agricultural loan portfolio finally gave way under the weight of what it had been carrying. It was absorbed by a larger regional bank, the kind that issued press releases and talked about consolidation and efficiency. The building downtown that had housed the bank since 1923 didn't stay empty long. It became a thrift store, racks of used clothing where loan officers once sat behind desks and explained interest rates to farmers who trusted them. The men who had worked there scattered. Some took jobs at other banks in other towns. Some retired. Some probably never thought about the farms they foreclosed on again. The farmers did. They remembered names. They remembered dates. They remembered the way it felt to sit across from someone who held all the cards and pretended the outcome was neutral. Rick Pawlowski never became a public figure. He didn't speak at conferences. He didn't write op-eds. When a reporter from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune interviewed him in 1989 for a retrospective on the farm crisis, Rick answered the questions plainly, without embellishment. When asked if he would do it again, knowing what it cost him, he didn't hesitate. Every time, he said. And when asked why, he said, because the alternative is living in a world where we all just watch each other drown, and I don't want to live there. The interview ran on page B7.
Most people never saw it. Rick didn't mind. He went back to his farm and kept working. He kept making the same choices he always had, not because he thought they made him virtuous, but because they made sense to him. He showed up when he could. He stayed home when he couldn't. He accepted that there were limits to what one person could do without letting those limits become an excuse for doing nothing. When he died in 2019, the news traveled quickly, faster than official notices ever could. His funeral was held in Blue Earth, and the church couldn't hold everyone who came. Farmers drove in from 3 states, some of the men Rick had helped directly, others who had only heard the story and wanted to pay respects to someone who had embodied something they feared was disappearing. Tom gave one of the eulogies. He talked about the auction, about the envelope, about what it meant to be saved by a neighbor at a moment when the system had already decided you were expendable. He didn't embellish. He didn't turn Rick into a saint. He told it the way it had been, which was enough. After the service, Margaret Pawlowski pulled Tom aside. There was something she wanted him to know. In all the years after the auction, she said, Rick never mentioned it, unless someone else did. Never sought recognition, never used it to make himself look good. He saw a problem, she said. He fixed what he could fix, and then he moved on. In the years since Rick's death, Tom has thought often about that sentence, about what it means to fix what you can and accept what you can't. Today, farmland in Minnesota averages $5,000 to $6,000 an acre in prime areas, numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1985. Young farmers trying to start out face the same trap in a different form, buying in at inflated prices, leveraging heavily, betting that commodity prices will stay high enough to service the debt. The numbers have changed. The structure hasn't. When the next crisis comes, and it will, the question won't be whether the system works the way it was designed to work. It always does. The question will be whether people choose to help each other inside that system, knowing the cost and choosing it anyway. Rick Pawlowski answered that question once on a cold March morning in 1985. He chose to stand in a yard when he could have stayed home. He chose to spend money he had saved for years on someone else's farm. He chose to believe that keeping one family on their land was worth the price he would pay for it. The banks expected to buy the Schroeder farm for a fraction of its value. Rick made sure they didn't. That choice didn't fix everything. It didn't save everyone. It didn't change how the system works. But it mattered. It mattered because it reminded people that systems don't have consciences, but individuals do. That profit margins can be calculated precisely, but some things refuse to fit on a balance sheet. That a community can be eroded quietly, file by file, or held together imperfectly by people who decide not to look away. Tom still farms. His son runs most of the operation now. His grandson talks about the future with a confidence Tom never takes for granted. The land is still there, worked and weathered, carrying the marks of everyone who has depended on it. And when Tom thinks back to that morning in 1985, to the sound of the auctioneer's voice cutting through the cold, to the moment Rick's hand went up and refused to come back down, he doesn't think about heroism or sacrifice. He thinks about a choice. A simple, costly choice, made by someone who understood that some losses are permanent and some are only permanent if no one intervenes. The world Rick chose to live in wasn't kinder by default. It was kinder because people like him decided it should be, one moment at a time.